Chapter 31. Slamming the car door behind him, Hansford headed up the short gravel drive leading to his front door. Pulling out his front door keys, he leaned to one side, allowing the streetlight to illuminate the keyhole. Once inside, he flicked on the hall light, managing to stop himself before stepping on the large manila envelope lying on the doormat. Stooping down, he picked it up, examining the outside as he pushed the front door shut with his heel. On the envelope's front, neatly typed, was Hansford, private and confidential. He kicked off his shoes by the hall stand and padded through to the living room. Tossing the envelope onto the coffee table, he moved towards the kitchen. Pushing against the swing door, he stepped over to the fridge and opened it. The interior light seemed inordinately bright as he winced. He was starving, and as usual, there was nothing to eat. There was never anything to eat in his fridge, he reminded himself. His body momentarily sagged forward in defeat. He quickly looked at his wristwatch. Everything would be shut by now. Grabbing a bottle of Gordon's and a couple of cans of tonic water, he moved back through into the living room. Banging the cans and the bottle on the coffee table, he picked up a glass tumbler and blew into it, coughing from the dust. Pulling out the corner of his shirt, he wiped the inside of the glass and began to pour. Staring at the envelope he commissioned, its potential contents made him hesitate. He took another swig. Should he open it? He knew he would. He needed to confirm in his conscious mind he'd made the right decision in establishing the true relationship between Pilgrim and Baxter. Whatever was in the envelope could potentially sever the remaining fragile threads of the relationship he had with Neath. He waited, still reluctant to take the final step. He had a final question to ask himself, and he had to answer it honestly. What would it take for him to never want to see her again? But he couldn't imagine such an eventuality. Picking up the envelope, he tore off the end, emptying the contents on the table in front of him. Leaning forward, he moved his hand across several sheets of neatly typed A4 paper. Under the paperwork, several stacked photographs revealed slithers of colour, the pieces to the puzzle of Neath's life. He picked up the photographs first. They were 12 by 9 matte in high definition, obviously taken by a first-rate camera. The first showed Baxter walking with Neath into La Amethyst. He began rifling through the rest. Most of them showed various stills of them together in what he interpreted as more than friendly poses. None of them were compromising, but they were all intimate. Baxter's hand at Neath's back, Baxter whispering in her ear, Baxter moving a tendril of hair from her face. There was one photo that made him anxiously study their expressions. It showed Neath stood in front of Baxter in her bra and a pair of jeans as Baxter looked at her. He recognized that look in her eyes of invitation. Baxter's gaze was unmistakable. It was adoration, love even. Hansford threw the photos onto the coffee table and refilled his glass. Pulling out the cover letter, he read, "On a more official note, I came up against a wall of the cyber kind. I was warned off and instructed not to delve any further. Do you know how impossible it is to send an email to my personal business account? The kind of security clearance that it would take, to say nothing of my own encrypted firewalls? The email told me to cease and desist, or I would find all my files deleted the next morning. They had a Pac-Man eat right across my screen, mind you, and head towards the icon for my hard drive, stop and wink at me, and then disappear. I don't know who these people are, Hansford, but what you have in this envelope is effectively what they wanted you to see. Don't bother asking me to dig any deeper." Hansford frowned, allowing the letter to fall on the table. He pulled the wad of paper making up the written report of Neath's life onto his lap and began to read. After 2 hours of difficult reading, with matching corresponding photographs to the report, he fell back in submission. Drunkenly pouring, he emptied the remaining dregs from the bottle of gin. He reached over, pulling out the photo of Pilgrim in her underwear, with Baxter looking at her. He began slowly ripping it in two, effectively separating them. Standing, he picked up the empty bottle and smashed it against the wall where it shattered. Rising unsteadily, he staggered to the foot of the stairs and began to make his way up. He needed to sleep, to blot out the sight of them. The one thing he knew for certain, if Neath thought she was going to run off into the sunset with Baxter, she was very much mistaken. The following morning, Hansford had come to the conclusion he couldn't neutralise Baxter without hurting Neath. 2 miles from his home, sitting behind the wheel of his car on his way to the office, he'd changed his mind. Expertly veering onto the motorway signposted for the West Country, he'd called in to tell Warwick he was going to check out the spot where Donata's body had been found. After 2 hours of traipsing around the Abbey ruins with nothing to show for it, he'd called it a day. Last night's images of Baxter with Neath were saturating his mind, prompting him to go in search of an out-of-the-way pub. He found himself taking a hair of the dog at the Otter Inn at Western Devon. Dropping a shot glass of whisky into his pint of Badgers, Hansford quickly downed the contents. He'd never had to pursue a woman before, least of all someone like Neath. She represented a set of problems that seemed insurmountable. He was the opposite of Baxter in clothing, manner, and perhaps more importantly, how he interacted with her. Sure, she always responded to him on a physical level, but that was all she came to him for. His initial commitment to be just her ally had been quickly undermined by the memory of their physical chemistry. Looking around him, he took in the few locals assembled at the bar of that small country pub in the late afternoon. A bunch of ruddy-faced farmers, if ever he saw some. They were raucous and well-fed, with their mud-encrusted boots to match. The place had fallen silent as he'd entered, but after his third trip to the bar, it was obvious to the few present here was a grockle, determined to drink himself right. Wood smoke hung suspended in the air with nowhere to go, as he returned once again to the bar, resting his elbows on a beer-sodden mat. The barman dutifully placed another pint and shot in front of him. A man dressed in blue overalls to his right spoke up, his warm Devonshire accent softening his vowels. "That'll put airs on your chest." A rumble of laughter passed through his companions. Hansford smiled. "Nice pint," he acknowledged. "Oh, Badgers is okay, but you'll save some money and time if you have a pint of otter." The last thing he needed in his inebriated state was to offend the locals. "Sure, a pint of otter ale," he instructed the barman. Taking a long sip off the foam, he smacked his lips. "Better," he stated, loud enough for them to all hear. "You'll not find one tastier than that. Where are you down from, then?" one of the group asked. "He's from London, you fool. Look at his shoes," the youngest of their group confirmed. Hansford looked quizzically down at his Italian leather shoes, now caked in mud, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You're good," he nodded drunkenly. "No good about it. There's a copy of the London Standard on your passenger seat." This made them all fall about laughing, leaving him to shake his head. "You should have my job. You're better at it," he smiled. "What's that, then?" one of them piped up. I'm looking into the death of the girl found at the old abbey, in an official capacity. Bad business, that, they all concurred. Ain't no trouble round these parts, less than someone from outside turns up, the man in blue overalls stated. I still reckon it was that git what sat in the alcove that night, the younger of them said. Hansford's ears pricked up. What git? He asked, straining to clear his fogged mind. He was odd, there's no doubt about that. They each nodded their heads in agreement. So, what made him an odd git? He was having trouble getting them to come to the point. Well, first of all, he treats our Sal like a common skivvy. She had to take his pint over to his table, and her with a barful. No manners, that's what. Then when she gets back, she says he was wiping his shoes with an handkerchief, what he was dipping in his beer. Flippin' strange if you ask me, the younger man concluded. Hansford couldn't believe his luck. It was a possible lead. His head strained against him trying to focus. Can you describe him? Well, he looked like you, didn't he? The younger man observed. Like me? Well, not exactly like you, course, but the same, you know, from London. From London? You know, clean nails and an attitude. That hardly means he was from London, he replied, exasperated. Sal thought he was trouble, the younger man said, obviously smitten with the barmaid. Walk out the pub and not pay your bill trouble. It was the way he looked at everyone, like we was beneath him. The man in blue overalls agreed. So Sal took down his number plate, the younger man stated. Sal took down his number plate? Hansford wanted to confirm he'd heard right. Course she did. Did Sal pass on this piece of valuable information to anyone? Well, he paid his bill, so no need to, the younger man chimed in. He was going to have to play this carefully. One word out of place, and they'd shut up like clams. Standing upright and puffing out his chest, Hansford asked, Anyone for a pint? Because I'm certainly going to have another. 2 hours later, he had a note of the Git's number plate in his hand and had learned more than he'd wanted about carving Frisians. Tumbling off his bar stool and being righted by his newfound friends, he lurched towards the men's room. Returning to his stall shortly after, he was just about to say thanks and good night when the man in the blue overalls leaned forward and wheezed into his ear. His beer-laden breath almost knocked Hansford back off his stool. Not expecting anyone, is you? Only one of your lot just turned up. Where? Hansford asked warily. He's in the snug. Want us to show him out? The man in the blue overalls stood erect while his friends put their beers down in readiness. Just then, Warwick appeared, searching through the dense crowd that now stood in the pub. Great, Hansford ground out, before putting his arm out to stop them moving forward. It's okay, it's work, he explained resignedly. Warwick caught sight of Hansford, noting his glazed expression. Ah, there you are. You want to try answering your phone once in a while. Warwick took in a very drunk, and he anticipated surly Hansford. Warwick, I'd like to introduce you to my new friends. Warwick put up his hand and pursed his lips. Hi, he said. That reminds me, John, we're having stuffed trout tonight. The man in the blue overalls gawped, while the rest of them roared with laughter. Any friend of London's is a friend of mine. Warwick received a slap to his back, causing him to lurch forward. Thanks, he said, confused. What'll you have? Oh, nothing for me. We must be going, Warwick said pointedly to Hansford. Come on with you. London, you'll have another depth charge, won't you? The man in the blue overalls stood up straight, legs apart, brokering no refusal. Don't mind if I do, Hansford grinned. The man in blue overalls eyed Warwick drunkenly. Pint of gut rot for the trout, And the same all round, he shouted to the barman. I really think we should be going. Warwick tried unsuccessfully to intercede as a pint of fermenting, cloudy yellow liquid was slammed in front of him. Warwick eyed it suspiciously. Down the hatch, he was encouraged. The only place you're going is Narnia. They all fell about laughing. Realising it was useless to object, Warwick braced himself and took a large gulp. As the liquid scorched his larynx and assailed his nostrils, the colour drained from his face. Hansford leaned forward. What is that stuff, anyway? Hansford slurred at Warwick. That there's scrumpy, finest in the county, guaranteed to keep you regular, the young man interrupted. Warwick was looking decidedly green around the gills. Look, Hansford, I have my orders to bring you back without delay. Draper told me to tell you, in his own words, to get your arse back pronto. He also knows where you are, and I'm not to lie for you. Hansford swore under his breath. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me. There were general drunken shouts of, Piss off then, London, before Hansford slammed the pub door behind them and the cold night air slapped him hard in the face. Calling forward, Hansford threw his car keys to Warwick to catch. You drive, and break the bloody speed limit. Warwick rolled his eyes. What about my car? A pox on that sewing machine. Hey, there's nothing wrong with my car, Warwick said. The Eastern Baltics make great cars, he muttered under his breath, striding forward. Oh, do shut up, Trout. Hansford had slowed. He was beginning to feel tired, and his alcohol-induced stupor was quickly being eroded by the cold. He wanted the company of a woman, namely Neath, and Warwick was falling seriously short. As they both finished surveying the full car park, they looked back at one another. Where did you say you parked the car? Warwick asked. This was the last straw for Hansford. His irritation level had just reached saturation point. Just press the bloody fob and the bloody car will beep, won't it? What kind of an intelligence officer are you, anyway? He shouted. Warwick pressed the fob to hear the single beep of a car horn 3 rows ahead, followed by an ear-splitting explosion as Hansford's car was blown several feet off the ground into fragments of twisted metal and flames. They were both catapulted backwards. Simultaneously, the pub windows facing the car park shattered from the force of the blast. Burning debris rained down, crashing onto cars and setting the car park hedge alight. Warwick was knocked unconscious to the ground. As Hansford scrambled to his feet, a nasty gash bleeding profusely across his cheek. Smouldering remnants from his car were burning through his coat. Tearing it off, he threw it to the ground. The pub door flew open as those inside poured out, pints in hand. Stepping over to Warwick's side, Hansford saw a faint trickle of blood seeping from his mouth. Checking his pulse, he exhaled, having found it. Grabbing his phone from his pocket, he called it in. This is a code black detonation authorization. Hotel, Alpha, November, Mike, India, 6, man down. Send an ambulance, fire and the bomb squad to these coordinates. A young woman hurriedly stepped in front of him, pushing him out the way. I'm a nurse. Hansford let her attend to Warwick as he strode back towards the entrance where his drinking buddies looked on, supping their pints. Stone the crows, London! Leave some frickin' paint on the frickin' walls, will ya? They were all shaken. What the hell was that? The man in the blue overalls asked weakly. That would be PE4, the preferred explosive of the British military, which leaves a distinctive tar smell in the air, he ground out, having regained his faculties. Is everyone all right? Couple of nasty gashes, that's all. Before long, the sound of police sirens could be heard approaching and came as a welcome relief, quickly followed by the paramedics and fire service. Within a few minutes, the car park had been blanketed in foam. The paramedics were busy working on Warwick, who was now sitting up whilst he talked with the local police. Hansford immediately got on the phone to Draper. "You're to come back here immediately," Draper ordered. "We need to sit down and discuss our next course of action." "I'll tell you what my next course of action is. I'm going to find out who blew the crap out of my car, and I'm going to rearrange their body parts," Hansford stated furiously. The bleeding wound on his cheek was saturating his shirt. He spoke through gritted teeth, looking extremely dangerous, as he muttered under his breath, "Someone has access to high-power British military explosives, and there aren't many people I know who have those sorts of connections." Draper realized there was no reasoning with him at this point. "What were you doing there?" he asked. "I have a lead," Hansford answered. "Let's hear it." Hansford relayed the number plate. "Hansford, you're going to need to return to Italy. Pilgrim's come up with an idea of the liquid door's location." "Great," Hansford said, annoyed. Walking back to his newfound friends, the man in blue overalls piped up, "Oh, just go ahead and pay the bloody alimony, London. It'll be cheaper." From across the river, hidden in the undergrowth, a pair of long-range binoculars took in the scene, quickly moving from Hansford to a figure that had just emerged from under the bridge. Phelps lowered his binoculars. On the bridge, Dreadnought cursed underneath his breath. How could something so straightforward have gone so wrong? Back in London earlier that morning, he'd stared at his phone in disbelief as the tracking device he'd attached to Hansford's car showed him heading directly to the pub he'd visited after killing Donata. He couldn't take the risk someone might have remembered him. He'd been forced to improvise. He'd have preferred a knife attack, which could easily be interpreted as coming from an unknown assailant, but he hadn't been sure it'd be convincing given Hansford's skills. So he'd gone for a generic occupational hazard instead, and it had backfired on him spectacularly. Hansford was alive and would be already narrowing the field of too few suspects. He needed a bargaining chip to buy him some extra time. Pilgrim was off limits, but he had no choice. He had to focus all his attention and effort on her now. Time was not on his side.